Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming today. I appreciate it. The topic of today's talk is going to be startup ecosystems, and we're going to be looking at the city of Boulder, Colorado. The structure of the talk today is going to go like this. I'll begin by introducing the city of Boulder. I will then move into a common explanation for why Boulder has such a vibrant startup ecosystem. I'll then move into a way of rethinking this common explanation and what's missing from that explanation. I'll then look at the Boulder and I'll put the story back together, connecting the common explanation along with these missing components. I'll talk about a person by the name of Brad Feld, who is very influential in understanding the Boulder ecosystem. I'll talk about a concept called setting the table and how government in particular can help set the table. I'll talk about 5 principles that can be followed by city governments. And finally, I'll talk about Vietnam and how we can apply these principles to Vietnam. Because even though the example of Boulder, Colorado takes place in America, which is a very different political system, the principles themselves can be applied here in Vietnam. So let's begin by talking about Boulder, Colorado. So if you look at a map of the United States, this area is Colorado, the state of Colorado. And the area here in the middle that's in a circle is what's known as the Boulder metro region. And one of the things that is really interesting is that if you look at the Boulder metro region, you can see that it is actually the #1 high-tech startup region in the United States. Silicon Valley is #3. So now this is a measure of density. So one of the explanations could just be that when we look at this is that Boulder, Colorado is a relatively smaller environment. So the number of people is about 500,000 people. But in terms of the overall number of startups and the density of startups, how many startups there are per person per capita, it's a very active place. So it raises the question, right? Why? Why is this so? Why is Boulder, Colorado producing so much startup activity? Well, when we look at different journalistic explanations, we can see that people are focusing a lot on 5 arguments. The first is that there's a lot of access to startup resources. There's a lot of what's known as incubators in Boulder. There's a lot of activities that are taking place. There's a lot of VC, venture capital investments that are coming into the city itself. So people around the country, around the world are recognizing Boulder, Colorado and putting money into it. The cost of living is relatively low comparatively. If you look at other startup hubs, other ecosystems, you can find that square footage is not very expensive. You can get talent for relatively inexpensive. Housing is not as expensive as major cities. And finally, you have the University of Colorado, which is there. And the University of Colorado provides a lot of capital resources, intellectual capital resources. They actually have one of the highest graduation rates. They have a lot of different science programs, things of that sort. So these are 4 common explanations. One of the when we talk about Boulder, Colorado, most people go back and they look at a person by the name of Brad Feld. And Brad Feld wrote a very famous book called Startup Communities. And this is an example of a way in which you can point to a single individual, an evangelical person, evangelist person, a person who is really instrumental in doing something and spreading the word about something. And Brad Feld is one of these types of people. He's very active, he's very visible, and he's done a lot. He moved to Boulder, Colorado in 1995. He started a venture capital firm called Foundry Group, which has been very, very active. He started something called TechStars, And this is transformed into something called Startup Weekend. I don't know if people are familiar with this, but there's something called Startup Weekend. This is an organization, Techstars, that promotes the development of startups. They have done quite a bit and extremely active in the startup world. And again, he wrote this very, very influential book called Startup Communities, which if you're interested in understanding ecosystems and how to develop an ecosystem, it's really a must-read. Now, according to Brad, he calls it the Boulder Thesis, and the Boulder Thesis is 4 parts. What holds all of these parts together is that it's driven by the entrepreneurs. That if you want to create an ecosystem, a startup ecosystem, you focus on the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur is the one who's driving everything. So the entrepreneurs must lead it. If something is going to happen, if it's going to be moving forward, the direction that it's going to be moving, you want to make sure that the entrepreneurs themselves are leading this, right? Not government. So you don't want it to be a top-down led process. You want the entrepreneurs, the ones that are going to be benefiting. Those are the ones that should be leading the process. The people who are leading it, these entrepreneurs, they need to have a long-term commitment. It takes a while to build an ecosystem. It's not something that happens overnight. It's something that requires effort. It requires a time commitment. And the leaders need to understand that. The startup community must be inclusive. As one of the things that Brad Feld really emphasizes is that you need to have continual activities. Right? So as you have these activities, you have to include everybody. Anybody who wants to participate in the startup ecosystem needs to be embraced and celebrated and encouraged to come in, regardless of what their professional role is or anything else like that. But everybody who wants to participate in a startup ecosystem should be encouraged to come into that ecosystem. Again, you want to have lots of activities. So you want to bring people together. The more people that you can bring together, the more types of activities you can have, the more ideas you're spreading. And a startup community, an ecosystem needs ideas. So ideas are important, coming together, personal interactions. These are the types of things that Brad Feld really emphasizes. So again, if you're going to follow the Brad Feld Boulder Thesis, what you want to do is you want to focus on entrepreneurs. You want it to be a bottom-up process. You want entrepreneurs to be leading the process. You want to have everybody come into the game. So you don't want to exclude anybody, but you want to be very inclusive. You want to have lots of events, right? You want to have that personal interaction. And you want to have a long-term thinking. You don't want to have short-term thinking, but you want to recognize that it's here for the long term. So most of the time, if you talk about Boulder, Colorado, people will, if you read things like that Inc. article, if you read the journalistic pieces, if you type in Boulder, Colorado startup ecosystem, Brad Feld will come up immediately. My argument, though, is going to be that there's a missing component, that Brad Feld, we have to look at him and what he says, but we also have to think a little bit differently. And one of the reasons why is because it was there before Brad Feld. Brad Feld came in 1995. But if you go back and you look at the top startups by density in 1990, Boulder was also there. Right? So it wasn't just in 2016, it wasn't just in 2010, it wasn't just after the Foundry Group, after Techstars, but it was happening before. So this raises the question, right? Why was it happening before? What was taking place? Well, the argument is that there's 3 necessary ingredients for a startup ecosystem, even going back to 1990. We want to look at a startup ecosystem. We want to focus on 3 things. We want to focus on universities, government activity, and what we can call anchor businesses. So first, we look at university. I mentioned the University of Colorado. The University of Colorado was there prior to 1990. It's always been a very active school. It's always had a very high graduation rate, and it's always produced a lot of scientific community, so the graduates. And one of the reasons why, again, if we look at government activity, we can look at national agencies, two that were located there. The third is the Air Force, which is also located in Colorado. And one side note is that if you want to look at the very successful ecosystems, there is a correlation between defense spending and ecosystem development. They've gone hand in hand because as one of the biggest purchasers of new technologies is defense departments. So defense departments are always pumping money into high-tech areas. But if you look at these pure research institutes, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, this is looking at what's taking place in the clouds, global warming. This is taking place, how do we understand changes in the atmosphere, how we're going to understand weather patterns, things like that. A National Institute of Standards and Technology. This is how the NIST is really engaged in pure research where it comes to understanding not just patent law, but also ways in which we're going to understand the development and the progression of technology. We also can look at anchor businesses. And the importance of anchor businesses is that in the literature, they talk about entrepreneurial genealogy. So if you look at businesses, what happens is that businesses such as these, IBM, Storage Tech, Oracle, they attract high-level engineers, right? Younger people, middle, and then as they develop their careers and they gain more knowledge and experience in the high-tech field, a lot of times they end up leaving and they start their own companies, right? These are the people that create the high-tech startups, the people who've started working at companies such as these, which we can call anchor businesses, these large companies. Storage Tech grew out of IBM in the 1970s. So you have an existence of three things that we can look at that Boulder has always had, going back to prior to 1990, and that's the university, it's government activity, and it's the existence of anchor businesses. Boulder City itself has also been very receptive and open and permissive when it comes to business. So if you look at what the city of Boulder has done, and this is also, if we go back and we look at the Bradfeld thesis, remember, Bradfeld didn't focus on what government's doing, right? He was talking about entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs should do this. They should be leading it. They should have a long-term focus. They should create events. They should open it up to everybody. But government is doing things. And one of the things that government can do is they can provide tax benefits, tax rebates. They can open it up. They can make a permissive business environment. Boulder City has what's called the flexible rebate program, where they give you benefits on city taxes. If you have to spend money on your rent, they give you rebates on that. They also have a microloan program. So if you're a small business and you make less than $2 million in revenue, you can get a $50,000 loan relatively easily, backed by the city of Boulder. So that encourages the formation of small businesses. And what's important about this is that if you look at the way in which it's not just, and if we go back to this slide at the beginning, oops. But if we go back to this slide, you can see that in the top, you have Boulder, Colorado. You have Fort Collins, Colorado. I mentioned the Air Force. This is where the Air Force is. They also have Colorado State University. You also have the Denver area. So you have three Colorado Springs. This is another big area where you also have a university and also more government money coming in. So you can see that something is going on in Colorado itself. Right? Colorado as a state is doing a lot to encourage startup businesses. And if you look, they have the city of Boulder has a Boulder Small Business Development Center. Financial institutions are getting involved, but there's also something called the Colorado Enterprise Fund, where Colorado as a state is providing benefits. The state business incentive programs, so the state is doing a lot to encourage the city and city small businesses, startups. So within this, what this says is that city governments are important, but state governments are important as well. And to the extent that you can link the two, city and state, you can add a lot and you can really promote a lot of development. I want to turn now to a concept called setting the table. And this comes from a person by the name of Lerner and a book called The Boulevard of Broken Dreams. And the subtitle of this is Why Public Efforts to Boost Entrepreneurship and Venture Capital Fail. And the argument that he makes is that if you look at governments that try to promote ecosystems, a lot of times they're not being very successful. It's money that's going down the drain. Why is that, right? And his argument is that the governments are too focused on sexy or big projects, and they're not focused on the smaller projects where the work actually takes place. And we can go back to the Brad Feld thesis, which is that it takes a long time. And so one of the points that's being made by Lerner is that there is time that needs to be put in. So if we want to set the table, if we want to create an environment, right? If government can exist to create a favorable environment for entrepreneurial success in the ecosystem, what does that mean? Well, you have to easily be able to move an idea to market. So once entrepreneurs come up with an idea and they want to create a startup, then they shouldn't have a lot of problems going there. I'm very happy to say that here in Vietnam there was going to be a big problem for startups. It was called Article 292, if anybody was following it, people in the startup ecosystem. And it was going to put people possibly in jail if they didn't have the right paperwork filed. And fortunately that the Vietnamese government listened to the concerns of the startup ecosystem, and they've now delayed that. So that was a very positive move on their part, because you want to encourage ideas to move to market. Within the startup community, one of the ways in which people talk about this is the startups want to produce what's called minimally viable products, MVP, which means that you want to create something and move it to market when it's just barely able. You want to get it out, you want people to test it, you want to get feedback. And that's the way that you can encourage more success, because you want to encourage failure. In the startup community, you encourage success by encouraging failure. You want people to test ideas, you want those ideas to fail. Famously, Mark Zuckerberg said, fail often, fail fast, right? That's what you want to do. You can focus on tax policy. So the government can set the table by focusing on tax policy, making sure that the people who do investments are going to get some type of, they're going to be able to reduce the risk, or they're going to be able to get benefits. So one way to do this is at the very beginning stages. So there is a debate in the literature about where you should put these incentives, the tax policy incentives. And one of the areas that people have found to be most effective is at what's known as the angel investing level. And angel investments are the investments that come in at the pre-seed stages, the early stages, where people are still, there's something called in terms of ecosystem or startup, a personal startup, development, it's called the valley of death, because you get started and you need time to develop your product, you need time to develop your startup, and it costs a lot of money. And during that time where it costs money to get started, the valley of death, it's hard to raise funds because you're not proving that you make money. So how do you raise funds before you prove that you're profitable? Well, one way you do this is by having angel investors, people that are willing to come in and take a large risk on your startup. And so one of the things that you can do is you can give benefits to the angel investors. We've seen this operate in Singapore and Malaysia and Israel and various states in the United States, and it's proven to be quite effective. So at the angel investment level, it's proven to be a very good way to promote tax policy. Finally, you want to have transparent and enforceable contract law. And this is really important because if you're going to develop a startup and you need to get money from investors in order to create that startup, then you want to make sure that you have contracts that can be enforceable. If you're going to have law that is based on intellectual property, you want to make sure that that's enforceable so people aren't going to steal your ideas. All of these things matter. So in terms of setting the table and creating an environment, we can focus specifically on three things. We can focus on moving ideas to the market. You want to make sure that there's a low barrier of entry. You want to make sure that there's favorable tax policies, particularly at the angel investment level. And you want to make sure that contracts can be, law is transparent and contracts are enforceable. Lerner comes up with 5 large principles when it comes to how government can best set the table. Again, like Feld's thesis, you want to focus on the entrepreneur first. So government exists, government is supposed to do things, government is supposed to set the table, but government is not supposed to lead the process. Government is supposed to provide a beneficial environment in which it can take place. The market needs to decide where things are going to happen, right? The government can't decide winners and losers. The market has to decide winners and losers. If we look at ecosystems where the government is trying to do things, they're not as successful. Again, like Brad Feld's thesis, you want to recognize that there's a long time period. These things, an ecosystem isn't built overnight. It takes time, right? You have to allow it to develop. So you can't rush it. You can't be anxious about development. You have to allow it to take place. Once you put programs in that are going to benefit entrepreneurs, you have to recognize that sometimes you change. Just like a startup needs to change, right? You pivot. So sometimes you put something in and you have to monitor. Is it working? Is it not working? You can't become so attached to an idea that you ignore measuring success. And that leads to the final one, which is that once you put something into effect, people feel like they have ownership of that and they don't want to give it up, right? And that becomes a problem. So he calls that the agency problem. And the agency problem can be at both the individual level, it can be at a government agency level, it can be at a bureaucratic level, right? Where people put something into effect and then they refuse to adapt and change to lessons that are taking place. So these are 5 principles that as you develop an ecosystem, these are things that you want to pay attention to. Another one that I would add is don't forget the quality of life. That as people, so I wrote, maybe the mountains did it, right? If you look at Colorado, it's a beautiful state. If people have an opportunity to go there, it's a beautiful blue sky, huge mountains everywhere. If you want to go skiing in the winter, it's easy to go skiing in the winter. If you want to go hiking in the summer, if you look at the health measurements in the United States, the people in Colorado are the healthiest in the country. If you look at where people go to, because of the elevation, but you have a lot of runners there who world-class marathon runners come from practice in Boulder, Colorado, and live there. Again, because of the elevation, Colorado is high up in the mountains. But you have to remember that people who are, it's a mobile society, right? And so people who are creative, who are entrepreneurial, they can move wherever they want. They can live wherever they want. So you have to recognize that if you're going to be focused on how do you create an ecosystem. Motivated people, entrepreneurial people, creative people, educated people have the ability to pick up and move, right? So they can live in different places for different reasons. I want to really emphasize this because not everywhere, if it was just that the mountains did it, that's kind of hard to replicate, right? Not everywhere you go is as beautiful as Boulder, Colorado, or as San Francisco, California. But everywhere is different. And so what you want to do is you want to recognize that there's no one-size-fits-all model. You want to maximize whatever benefits you have. So Hanoi has benefits, right? Hanoi has a lot of benefits. It has a historical environment. It has a wonderful culture. The people are great, right? You want to maximize what you can within that environment. So if we now turn to Vietnam, what we've looked at now is we've looked at Boulder in particular. We've talked about how Boulder is successful. We've talked about these principles that can be put into effect. And now let's look at Vietnam and ask these questions, right? First, can the Vietnamese government invest in technology? Absolutely, right? If it wants to, the Vietnamese government can promote technological research, just like the atmospheric research. It can promote pure research. It can promote whatever it wants. The Vietnamese government can put money into whatever type of research it wants to promote. Does Vietnam have active universities? Absolutely. All of the major cities have very good universities. The Vietnamese people are extremely smart people, right? To the extent that you want to talk, are well-educated people. When it comes to engineering quality, the Vietnamese people rank highest among the best in the world, better than the American people. Right? There's something going on within the Vietnamese educational system that promotes mathematics, that promotes engineering. One of the issues is it's an outsourcing economy, it's an outsourcing society, so you have certain types of engineering skills, but the engineering skills that are here are among the best. I've been to talks where somebody from Google said that, who looks at all of the engineers in Southeast Asia. He said that Vietnamese engineers are the best in Southeast Asia. So there's no reason why, in terms of when we look at an educated population, there's no reason why Vietnam can't compete, that the startup ecosystem can't compete. Are there anchor businesses? Remember, we talked about how people go and they become engineers and then they leave and they start their own companies. Well, absolutely. Samsung's here, Intel's here. We have other large corporations that are coming here as well, high-tech corporations. So we have all of the ingredients here in Vietnam, right, for really good startup ecosystems. And in fact, the Vietnamese national government, the Ministry of Science and Technology, is doing a lot. We have to remember that the Deputy Prime Minister, the Prime Minister, has announced that 2016 is the year of the startup. Right? And if you look, the Ministry of Science and Technology has been doing a lot. They've been pumping a lot of money into the ecosystem. The city of Ho Chi Minh announced that they're going to be putting money into the ecosystem. The city of Hanoi has announced that they're going to be putting money into the ecosystem. And the city of Da Nang recently had a startup fair in which they announced that they're going to be putting money into the ecosystem. Now, when you look at each of these three, remember we want to go back and we want to talk about learners' principles, though, right? And are these top-down methods, or are they encouraging the entrepreneurs to drive the process? And in looking at the three cities, I'd say that Da Nang is doing the best in terms of following this model of having the entrepreneurs lead it. Microsoft is taking a lead role in helping to develop. And it also may be because, remember, just like with Learner's 5 points, that the once people take agency, right, and once they take ownership of it, then they hold on and they're less willing to give up control. So if you look at Da Nang, which is the youngest city in terms of an ecosystem, they're the ones that are they're focused on having the Microsoft. They just had this fair in which they announced an initiative called MAIN, the Mekong Angel Initiative Network, which is going to be headquartered and operating out of Da Nang. And just like Brad Feld, just like you can pinpoint an individual and you can say, well, this person's providing a spark. I think in Da Nang, there's an investor. His name is Steve Landman. And when I was at the Da Nang Startup Fair, about 5 of the foreigners that were there speaking, who were foreign investors who had only just come to Da Nang for the first time, they were all there because they were his friends. Right? And so you can really pinpoint, in terms of a history, it might be that this guy is Steve Landman. When we look back at Da Nang's history, it might be because of him, right? That he's really promoting this. He's responsible for working with the Da Nang University. He's creating an incubator there. He's working with an organization called Mekong Business Initiative, and he's promoting angels to come there. So he's really doing a lot, and so again, we can't discount this concept of a single individual who's being an evangelical. Now, one of the problems, though, when we look at Vietnam, and this just came out, this was put out by GEM, the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, and this is a report looking at things from 2015 to 2016. On a scale of 1 to 9, on most measures, we see that Vietnam is under 5 on a lot of very important ones. When it comes to government policies that support or are relevant to startups, it's a 4 out of a 4.33 out of 9. The one that's the highest is actually the infrastructure. Right, and everybody here in Hanoi knows wherever you go, you have high-speed internet. I was in Singapore, and it was harder to get high-speed internet access in Singapore than in Vietnam. It was much easier to get in here, and everybody has mobile phones, smartphones, everything like that. So the physical infrastructure is here. In fact, it's here to a large extent, even more than many places in the United States. There's a culture that's a 5. The internal market dynamics are very strong. But if you look where it's not very strong, you have entrepreneurship education. In fact, this is one of the real weaknesses when it comes to Vietnam. I mentioned that there's engineering. When we look at engineers and mathematics, we can see that Vietnam is among the best in the world. But when we look at soft skills, we see that Vietnam is very bad at that. In fact, if you look at data, the companies that come to Vietnam, they have to re-educate people. They spend a lot of time re-educating people in order to get those soft skills. And the management level is not very high. So those are problems, right? So how do you create businesses? So we also see that government entrepreneurship programs are relatively weak. There's relatively weak research and development transfer. So we're going back to those other things, right? The learner principles, right? Where you want to move easily to market. You see that on a lot of these things, it's not very good. And taxes and bureaucracy is not very good. Internal market burdens is not very good. In fact, if you look at world rankings in terms of where Vietnam stands, in terms of ease of doing business, it's very, very low in the world. It's a very hard place. So what this says is that if we want to move forward, right, we saw that each of the cities, the national government, all 3 major cities, are all putting money into the ecosystem. What we want to ask now, though, is the money being put in the right place? So if the government is spending money, but they're promoting incubators, or they're giving money to startups for awards or things like that, is that the best way to spend the money? If you're a startup, you might think it is because you might be winning the money. But if you want to build the ecosystem, is that really the best way to spend your money? Because is that letting the market decide winners or losers? Or is it saying that it's top down and the government's going to decide winners or losers? Maybe a better way to spend money is by focusing on service providers. Maybe a better way of spending money is to hire lawyers and accountants who are going to focus on how do you create the best laws? How do you give these services to startups? Maybe what you want to do is you want to create a cadre of lawyers, of service professionals just for startups, and give those services for free, make them freely available. Going back to you want to ensure that there's momentum that the entrepreneurs and the business community is providing. Maybe one of the things you want to do, remember we talked about the Brad Feld thesis, and where you want to make sure that there's ideas are spread, and you want to make sure that there's physical connections. Maybe the best way to spend money is for the government in Vietnam to buy buildings, house lawyers, house accountants, open up the buildings, provide free Wi-Fi access for startups, right? And let startups go there and do what they can. Don't give them money, don't give them awards, don't give them anything like that. Spend money on events, spend money on educational activities, spend money on things like that. But don't try to decide who's going to win or lose. Let the market decide who's going to win or lose, but provide the environment, the physical structure, set the table so that the market can decide. Finally, I would say that this money should be spent on quality of life issues. Again, let's go back and what I said before, that quality of life is everybody's going to have a different understanding of what quality of life means, right? Some people are going to want to live in Boulder, Colorado. Some people are going to want to live in San Francisco. Some people are going to want to live in Hanoi. But everybody wants to have a good environment, right? Everybody wants to have good food, safe food, right? People want to have good health care. So to the extent that the government wants to promote startups, a year of the startup, right? Perhaps these are good ways of putting money forward. Clean up the air. Put money into public transportation so that there's not so much pollution going forward. Focus on the food, right? There's a lot of it. People are constantly talking about food safety. There's a lot of articles about food safety. Perhaps one of the best things that the government could do is focus on that. Focus on healthcare, right? There's stories that Vietnam is going to have the most cancer of any country in the 2020s, right? I mean, that's a horrible statistic. We need to fix that. So what can we do to fix that? Well, if you want to promote startup activity, maybe those are the things you should be focused on. You shouldn't, so it's sort of counterintuitive. Right? You want to promote startup activity, the government should focus on spending money, not necessarily on startups themselves, but on everything that surrounds the startup. Right? Focus on training programs, focus on providing those entrepreneurial skills at a younger age. I know that one of the initiatives that here at the American Center that's being talked about is helping with younger people, 15, 16-year-olds, and teaching entrepreneurial skills. And so these are things that are can be very beneficial, right? In America, we have everybody grows up and you sort of have a lemonade stand at a certain age. It's sort of a thing that, right, people, there's an entrepreneurial spirit in the United States that's there. And so we take some skills for granted. But here in Vietnam, you have these same things, right? In Vietnam, you have a tarp, 2 poles, and a pot, and phở ba, right? And so you have it. It's here, but it just needs to be emphasized. So I think these are some lessons that we can learn from Boulder, Colorado, in terms of how to create a startup ecosystem. Thank you very much.